to just make some opening remarks before I hand it over to Chief Kane, who'll get into the meat and bones of this entire informational session. Just to give you some contextual background, and like I said, we're streaming this live on YouTube, and then this video will also be available on the city's website. And this is one of many workshops and informational sessions that the city's been doing. And as we all know, back in January, we all were witnesses of the devastation of wildfires that ravaged through the Pacific Palisades as well as Altadena. Within a month of that incident, the city held a town hall to inform the public on what we're doing for wildfire preparedness. We felt it was so important that we immediately pulled our resources together and we had that town hall. And I hope some of you were able to attend Saturday's town hall that was hosted by Assembly Member Murasuchi. It was a similar setup as our town hall in February, but again, it was intended to provide more information to the public on how the peninsula is prepared for wildfires. So one of the things that we left it off at back in February was the preparation of the state's fire hazard maps. And some of you may already be familiar with this, some of you may not. This is a state prepared map. It's by CAL FIRE. And it's the state fire marshal that basically assesses the entire state and determines, based on different variables that Chief Kane is going to go over, determines whether you live in an area that's considered a high fire severity zone, or an area that's a high zone, or a moderate zone, or a low zone. And those zones then have regulations that follow that designation. In 2008, the City Council adopted, based on the state preparing the map, it was basically presented to the community and to the council that we had to adopt that map. And what it did was it essentially created, or I designated the entire city. I would say 98% of the city was designated as a very high fire severity zone. And I remember that because I've been with the city for so long. I remember the discussions that the council had back in 2008. There was a lot of concern on what the consequences, the unintended consequences and the consequences would be with that designation. And one of our council members at the time was an insurance attorney. He's now a judge, maybe a retired judge, but he was an insurance attorney, and he had expressed a concern on how this designation would impact insurance. And I think we all have seen how that designation impacts insurance, even though it's not supposed to. I think inherently, and maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but this is my own opinion, that I think it does inherently impact insurance and other factors. So when the state started to work on designating or updating that map, and there are the way that the state designates these high fire zone maps is there's local areas, and there are local responsibility areas and state responsibility areas. And the state responsibility areas are those territories that are not regulated or managed, I would say, by designated fire departments, more of CAL FIRE, and the local areas are either managed by a local fire department or a county fire department. So most of LA County is part of a local responsibility area. So there are two sets of maps, and the map that was just recently published is for the local responsibility areas. And so tonight we want to give you that information, and I can tell you the map has changed. It has dramatically changed, because where we were 98% enrolled and designated as a high fire severity zone, we're no longer, the entire city is no longer designated that way. In fact, a huge swath of land has been downgraded to a moderate or a high fire zone, not a high fire severity zone. We're going to explain to you what that means. We're going to explain to you this evening the methodology that was put into it. And by the way, this is the map I put up on the screen. You could see the difference. And if you're curious where your property is, this is a very interactive map that was published by the LA County Fire Department, where you could just slide, if you go to their website or look at it on your device, you could just slide the screen and see how it's changed. And it's dramatically changed from what you see here, where most of the city, except for the Panhandle off Western Avenue, was high fire severity zone. This is what you're looking at right now. So to that end, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chief Kane, who will give you more details on this new designation.
Thank you, Ara, for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. Assistant Chief Brian Kane, Los Angeles County Fire Department. I'm here tonight to speak to the new maps, as was previously stated. It's a little confusing. I'm going to do my best to do this, and coincidentally, it's a little odd, actually, that the timing of this is happening the way that it is in the wake of the two fires that we had to the north of us in early January. However, there's been a lot of work and time that has been going into these maps. It wasn't something that just happened recently. It's been happening over a number of years to reach the conclusions in the current maps that we have tonight. So I'll try to explain that the best that I can. Also, it's going to be a lot of reading for me because I wanted to take and articulate exactly the messaging that was disseminated from Sacramento and CAL FIRE about these maps. So unfortunately, it's going to be a little bit of a death by PowerPoint tonight, but I wanted to make sure that I say exactly what the intent is from the state level. So this is what's happening. We've already been talking about this. CAL FIRE has updated local responsibility areas in the fire hazard severity zone maps. The state fire marshal has already released these maps to us and the cities. The interesting thing about it is the first time that I saw these maps was the first time that the city manager and all the cities have seen these maps. Los Angeles County Fire Department, and actually all the fire departments within the state except for CAL FIRE, have nothing to do with these maps. We don't give any input. We don't have any say over them. We get them as the city gets them, and then it's our job just to enforce them and do what the state has intended. So like Ara had already mentioned, this is an example of previously what the maps were in 2007 through 2011. And the new proposed maps are, of course, this, which we've already spoken about. One thing that I would like to add on this slide is because of the adoption phase of these maps, where you were last year on these maps as it relates to your inspection cycle, defensible space, and the very high fire severity zone is where you will also be for this inspection cycle that's coming in June. So if you are falling off the map, you're not actually falling off the map until 2026. So everything that happened last year with defensible space, your inspections, us coming around, and so forth, everyone on the peninsula will still see that consistently this year as well. So this is how the state rolls out the plan. It starts in the northern part of the state first. As you can see, the maps in the entire state were actually redone. And the rollout phase is here. And we were the last area on the state to actually get the rollout. And like I said, recently disseminated to us. So as city manager had already mentioned, the state responsibility area, the SRA, the fire hazard severity zone, was completed in 2024, but the maps weren't released to us until recently. So the county is actually a contractor of the state. So anything that is unincorporated, which is considered in the SRA area, Los Angeles County Fire Department does cover. And for an example, something that's very close to us that is completely SRA or state responsibility area is the island of Catalina, which myself and of course Chief Kelsey over here are responsible for. So the recommended LRA maps will be expanded to include the high and moderate fire severity zones that were not previously mapped in 2010. So this is going to be, I'm going to start now talking about the background and how they've come to the conclusions that they've come to as it relates to the new maps. So they take a 2-kilometer grid of climate data covering the years from 2003 to 2018, and that is being used to update the maps. Updated model will adjust fire intensity scores based on the most extreme fire weather at a given location. Ember transport is being modeled based on local distribution of observed wind, speed, and direction values instead of using a generic buffer distance for urban areas adjacent to wildfires. So those of you that have come to my previous presentations, I keep talking about EmberCast, 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 and winds. And this is why the EmberCast has been so important in the updating of these maps and the forecasting of those embers. So the new maps are coming out. They will be adopted by your local city. Local cities can add to or increase the fire hazard severity zone. They can choose to make it larger than the proposed maps are. Any additions to the very high fire severity zone require substantial evidence of record to make the change. So that would be historical fire weather or weather patterns on the peninsula that would suggest the fire hazard severity zone be expanded. However, the local agency cannot remove or decrease the size of the fire hazard severity zones as recommended by the State Fire Marshal. Why are the fire hazard zones maps being updated? So the maps are being updated to more accurately reflect the zones in California that are susceptible to wildfire. The hazard mapping process will incorporate new science and local climate data and improve fire assessment modeling in determined hazard ratings. So what do the maps actually measure? What do they represent? The fire hazard severity zone map evaluates hazards, not the risk. Hazard is based on the physical conditions that create a likelihood and expected fire behavior over a 30 to 50 year period without considering mitigation measures such as home hardening, recent wildfire, or fuel reduction efforts. Risk is the potential damage a fire can do to the area under existing conditions, accounting for any modifications such as fuel reduction projects, defensible space, and ignition resistance building constructions. How are fire hazard zones determined? So CAL FIRE uses the best available science and data to develop and field test a model that served as the basis of zone assignments. The model evaluated the probability of the area burning and potential fire behavior in the area. Many factors were included, such as fire history, vegetation, flame length, blowing embers, proximity to wildland, terrain, and of course, weather. What data will be included in the new model, and how does this differ from the previous models? So as previously stated, a 2-kilometer grid of climate data covering the years from 2003 to 18 is being used for the update. The previous model used stocked weather inputs across the state to calculate wildland fire intensity scores. The updated model will adjust fire intensity scores based on the most extreme fire weather at a given location, considering temperature, humidity, and wind speed. Now, so those of you that have been to my other presentations, temperature, humidity, and wind speeds are also what calculate our red flag conditions or our critical fire weather. In addition, ember transport, again, is being modeled based on local distributions of observed wind speed and direction values instead of using a generic buffer distance for urban areas adjacent to wildlands. So what is the difference between various fire hazard severity zones? Classification of wildland zone as moderate, high, or very high fire hazard is based on the average hazard across the area included in the zone, which have a minimum size of 200 acres. In wildlands, hazard is a function of a modeled flame length under the worst conditions and annual burn probability. Both these factors generally increase with increasing hazard level, but there may be instances where one value is very high and the other is low, pushing the overall hazard rating into a more intermediate ranking. On average, the modeled flame length and burn probability increase by roughly 40 to 60% between hazard classes. Classification outside of wildland areas is based on the fire hazard of the adjacent wildland and the probability of flames and embers threatening buildings. Why does this model place an emphasis on the spread of embers? Embers spread wildfire because they can travel long distances in wind and ignite vegetation on roofs, attics, by getting into vents and on decks. So as previously in some of my presentations, we talk about that embercast. So embercast is really what's responsible for significant fire spread and also getting into those structures. And under the most extreme conditions, we can see embers spotting fires 5 miles in front of a flaming fire front. So that's why embercast is so important, and that home hardening aspect is extremely important as well. Is my property in the very high fire severity zone? So you can search your address by your current designation on the web at OSFM. The site is here. You can plug your address into that site, and it will tell you exactly which zone that you respective address and where you live, if in what zone it actually is in. Give you a second to take that.
The PowerPoint slides will be on the website along with the recording on rpvca.gov/emergency. And this map is also embedded there.
Everybody that wanted it, were they able to take down that site to look up the respective address? Okay. So what are the key elements of the fire hazard severity zone model? 2 key elements: probability of an area burning and expected fire behavior under extreme fuel and weather conditions. The zones reflect areas that have similar burn probabilities and fire behavior characteristics. The factors considered in determining the hazard within wildland areas are fire history, flame length, terrain, local weather, and potential over a 50-year period. Outside of wildlands, the model considers factors that might lead to buildings being threatened, including terrain, weather, urban vegetation cover, blowing embers, proximity to wildland, significant fire history, and a fire hazard severity in nearby wildlands. Why is my property in a different zone than the adjacent area, which looks very similar to mine? In wildland areas, zone edges occur based on distance to the wildland edge. Because hazard in these areas is largely determined by incoming embers from adjacent wildland, urban areas that are similar in vegetation type and housing density may have a change in fire hazard severity zone class as the distance to the wildland edge increases. Areas immediately adjacent to wildland receive the same fire hazard severity zone as the wildland where fire originates. And the model that produces lower scores as the distance to wildland edge increases. Now, we're gonna get a lot of questions probably coming up, like my neighbor across the street is outside the zone, but I'm in the zone. But just understand that a line has to be drawn at some point and at some particular location, and there's just gonna be a coincidence where that might happen to you or your neighbor or somebody that you know, or in your exact neighborhood yourselves. In wildland areas, zone edges are a result of the way zones are delineated. Specifically, zones represent areas of similar slope and fuel potential. Zone boundaries divide zones based on geographic and vegetation features that align with fire hazard potential. Although at a local scale, it may appear that the immediate area is similar on both sides of the edge, the class value within a zone is based on the average hazard score across the whole zone. Areas that are in the zone but not immediately adjacent to a local area can have an influence on the final zone classification. So I know that's very confusing, but they use some very sophisticated modeling on all aspects of the peninsula to update the zones to their current state. And all of these zones fall under the legislative process. The state legislature has passed a law for cities and counties to implement. Cities must ratify, though the state can also ratify it as well. And this is Assembly Bill 211, if you should like to look that up. More about the legislative process. Timeline: two concurrent events. The recommended LRA fire hazard severity zone maps must be made available for public review and comment within 30 days of receipt from the state fire marshal. So that's what we're kind of doing tonight. We're getting this out there to all of you. The recommended maps must be adopted by ordinance within 120 days of receipt from the state fire marshal. So the city is on a timeline of 120 days from their date of receipt in order to adopt these new maps. Here's some more on the timeline of the maps and so forth. There's a lot more information on the CAL FIRE website. There's even a link here at the bottom where you can compare the old to the new with that sliding scale that City Manager Maranian was speaking about. That's all I really have as far as the maps are concerned. I know it's very kind of complicated and kind of scientific, but just understand that it wasn't a haphazard decision that the state made, like, oh, we're just gonna cut all these houses and addresses out. They did some very sophisticated modeling in order to reach the conclusions that they did. That's all I have about the maps. I guess, questions now, or?
Can you talk a little about the implications for next year's festival space?
Yeah, so the question was implications from this year to next year. So this year will be exactly the way that it was last year as far as defensible space and the associated inspections. Next year, you'll see a difference. So if your respective address is falling off of the list, you're not gonna see us next year. You're not gonna receive anything in the mail, and you're just gonna go about like life as normal. So that's the big question on the changes that we're gonna see on the peninsula, the entire peninsula as well, from this year to next year. Anything else?
And the difference is, we now have, you're off the map, you're moderate, you're higher, you're very high.
Yeah, so there's different zones, like she said, very high, moderate, and high, and so forth. Only the very high fire severity zones are inspected by the fire department. Now, it's still a good idea, and it's very prudent for all of you to still maintain your properties in a state of fire readiness, and of course, maintain your houses with the home hardening aspects included. But yeah, next year, there will be a change as far as how many inspections we will have on the peninsula.
I'm gonna talk a little about the city's work, and then we'll.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
We'll do Q&A in just 1 minute. I just want to talk about our steps, and then we'll walk through any questions for the defensible space or anything related to the map. Just so you guys are aware of what the city's doing, we received those maps March 24. We're doing this info session. We do have a webpage online. It has that sliding scale. It will have the recording for this. It will have the information you saw outside. That will be all available. Any questions and their answers, I'll have those uploaded by next week. So keep an eye out for that. And then if you're online, if you're watching this or you're watching this later, you're welcome to email me any questions or feedback, lmohammed@rpvca.gov. I'll include anything I get in the next few days on that Q&A list. And if you want to send me something after that, you can, and I'll do my best to answer it for you. After this meeting, city staff will huddle up with LA County Fire, and we will assess the maps too. We will provide a suggestion on the adoption of the maps. As Chief Kane said, we can recommend raising areas, so we can move up areas that are no longer in any zone or in a moderate or high zone. We can move those up to high or very high, however we would like. So we can make that, but we cannot reduce the zones. We will have our regular city council meeting on June 17th, where we will present our recommendations to city council. And then whatever ends up coming from that, we will put this on a consent item for adoption of the ordinance of the maps on July 1st. And as Chief Kane said, within 30 days, we need to submit that to the state fire marshal, and this will be incorporated in the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan and our general plan safety element. Both of those are currently being updated this year, so that will be incorporated there. So now for questions. If anyone wants to come up to the mic and speak, feel free to. You can raise your hand, just speak loudly if you would like. And then again, if you have questions online, feel free to email those if you think of something later. And that's our website where that webpage will be, so.
And Luna, they should probably come up to the microphone for the recording.
Yeah. So anyone who wants to ask a question, feel free to come up to the mic and you can ask. And I'm guessing they're all for you.
Hi, good evening. Gwen Butterfield, Rancho Palos Verdes resident. I have a question on on the presentation, it was stated that the city can add in areas, but that it requires substantial evidence of record to make the change. I'd like to know if you could elaborate on that a bit further, being a resident who's grateful that we're no longer in the very high fire zone.
Yeah.
I'd like to understand that better.
So evidence that would be pertinent to make a change like that or raise a certain level back up to in that area would be like historical fire data. If over the last 100 years, we have records of where fires typically take place, how they travel, the ways they spread. So that would be one piece of evidence they could use, say, in a certain area, like there's frequent fires in this area, they tend to travel in this particular direction. It would be great if these neighborhoods here remained in those particular zones. Also, if a canyon or an area of the peninsula were to come into what we call alignment with those northeasterly winds, which are also known as the Santa Ana winds, where the winds are constantly blowing up a canyon during those northeasterly fire weather conditions, that could also be a time when a city could choose like, hey, this area is prone to these northeasterly, very dry, super hot winds. It would be great if these areas also were raised in elevation. Another thing would be fuel loads. If the city were to think that, there is excessive fuel loads in some of the open spaces, they could potentially gain a lot of heat and make flame or fire travel exponentially in a certain area and jump to different neighborhoods. That would also be some evidence of concern that could potentially raise that area back into that fire hazard severity zone. City Manager, do you have anything else?
Yeah, let me just, at this point, there's no indication that we're going to present or recommend to the city council an upgrading or intensification of the severity zone maps. That said, I think the practice of all of you in the community should remain the same. We should still be vigilant and do our efforts to harden our homes and protect our properties. In fact, what I've asked the building official to do is to look at our building code and see if when we come to the council in June, whether we should recommend any amendments to the building code that would require home hardening as part of an addition or new construction. We wouldn't require it just off the cuff saying every household needs to do X, Y, and Z. But if you were doing a substantial or significant renovation or remodel or tear down, rebuild, what would those new building standards be? So the building official's looking at that. And of course, if we're going to propose any amendments, there would be public notification on those changes to the building code, which is Chapter 15 of the Rancho Palos Verdes Municipal Code.
And just to highlight something Chief Kane said earlier, again, what Ara said, we have to assess, but we're at this time not looking at increasing those zones. However, if we did decide to increase a zone to medium or high, it would not have any implications to defensible space inspections. So if you're not in a zone and we had a discussion and for one of the reasons Chief Kane mentioned said, hey, we want this area to be moderate, that would not have an implication towards defensible space inspections. Part of our assessment will be what other implications could it potentially have, right? So that is something we'll be looking at, but just wanted to highlight that.
Yes, most likely yes, because of the nature of the entire peninsula. And as we saw, I mean, there were areas that back in January had to evacuate, and there was a risk of fire in areas that are not even mapped as a fire risk area or a hazard area. So yes, the building code is a very different mechanism to encourage and to require the home hardening to protect properties. So, and that, like I just mentioned, I've asked the building official to look at the building code to see if we need to strengthen it to add more requirements. And that's only triggered if you're doing a substantial addition or remodel or a tear down rebuild. But right now, in terms of defensible space and the clearing and all those requirements that LA County Fire Department requires, especially in your neighborhood, you were not part of that high fire severity zone, and you're still not under the new maps. Yes, and maybe, should we grab the?
Well, I was going to, but the people just started raising their hands.
I'll play talk show host. Here you go.
Oh, goodness, okay. Coming to me, huh? There's a paper out there that says that, if you get rid of your lawn and stuff, it's like $3, whatever. My question about that, about 5 years ago, I have a little house, but it's a humongous lawn, 5,000 square feet. And it would have cost $27,000 back then to get rid of the thing, and I think they were offering me like $8,000, which is a bit much for a retired school teacher. But the problem was not taking out the lawn. The problem was all the flowers or all the things they wanted planted in it. In other words, they wanted that entire area covered. And I don't need to have that much cactus in my life. I mean, why do we have to have that much planting? I don't mind a little dirt or maybe stone coverage. So in other words, it's a discouragement to do what we're supposed to do when you demand that they have that much planting.
And who did you talk to? Who was the rebate? Was it through Cal Water or was it through the West Basin Water District? It wasn't through the city, so it was.
Okay, it was about, as I say, 5 years ago, and I don't know who was doing it then. Is this through the city this time?
No, the city's not offering these programs. These are offered through either Cal Water or the West Basin Water District.
Well, how do we deal with the fact that they want too much planted?
Well, I think that's a conversation you need to have with their planners who are offering this rebate program. I think right now it's being through SoCal Water Smart, and that's through the West Basin Water District.
Okay.
So we'll give you that information. We can put you in touch with some people over there.
Because that's what stopped me in my tracks.
Okay, understood. If you want to hand the mic behind you.
There you go.
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to piggyback on my last question, and I know that I guess you mentioned something about the building code. The building code is changing, I guess, next year, right? So, are there going to be?
Let me clarify, not necessarily. So what I've said is I've asked the building official to review the code and to determine whether amendments are needed. So that hasn't been determined yet.
Okay, but the California Fire Code will be coming into effect in January, next year, 2025, right? So I'm
When
not
you say
sure.
the fire code, do you mean the building code or do you mean this map, the hazard severity zone map?
So the California Building Code and all of the codes will be coming into effect in January.
Okay, so there's an
So-
update to the building
Yeah.
codes?
So I guess my question was, what will be on the, I guess, the new, requirements, and if it is going to be more stricter, because that
They
would
usually do get more
that
strict.
will be required in the high fire severity zones, right?
So the building code, the California Building Code gets updated approximately every 3 years, and the city does adopt the state code, and then we add to that code requirements based on the city being in a high fire zone. So yes, it's most likely that we will continue to add things as we learn that there are more tools in the box that we can use to protect our property. So if you're looking at building, it sounds like you're going through a construction process, and if you want to get in under the current codes, you can, but if you wait, yeah, you'll be subject to the next version of the building codes.
And you don't know what, I guess.
Not at this time.
Coming.
I'm not aware of what the changes are. I do know currently in the building code section, which is chapter 15 of the municipal code, has extra requirements or additional requirements because of the fire zone that we're in. Yeah, and one of the things, yes, we require a certain type of roof material. We require all new construction to be double pane windows. In fact, they say that one of the things, and I don't know if you touched on this, but I know Chief Kane has mentioned this in the past, one of the reasons why the embers and fires spread and structures burn is not only do embers get into the attic and the crawl space and burn the structure from the inside out, but the heat gets so intense that single pane windows end up breaking, bursting, and then the embers get in, the fire gets in, and structures burn from the inside out. So it is known that double pane windows will help save structure. So it's an upfront cost that you have to bear, but it protects your property, it hardens your property. And plus, it's good for insulation and soundproofing and all those other great things. But I know it's very expensive. Trust me, I know.
My question is for the LA County Fire Department. I was wondering if there's a way to obtain prior defensible space inspections, if they exist for a particular property address, and that's basically, you know, if you're a prospective buyer for a property and you're just, you know, having to investigate during escrow. So defensible space
Yeah, so
inspections, are they available?
Yeah, but it was kind of a two-part question. So if you're looking to buy a house and you want to know what zone it is in, so where you're potentially going to buy, or you want to know?
No, if you already know a defensible space inspection is required of that particular property and you're already in escrow for that particular property, and you want to know.
If there is a home, I think this got cut off. If you're looking to buy a home, the realtor has to disclose that house is in the fire hazard severity zone. And prior to it being escrow, it does have to meet all of those defensible space requirements.
Yes.
Yes.
And how do I find out if there is such an inspection that was already done in prior years?
That would be, if you're going to sell or buy, that would be through your realtor. Or
Does the fire department not have a record of that?
we can look up your address and see. My colleague over here to the right might be able to look up that address.
Wasn't there a map? There was some sort of interactive map where you put the address.
There is,
Yeah.
so I can show you after. We do have a request map where you can submit a request to either get an AB 38 inspection done if there's no prior record, or your local inspector for this area can pull up the previous defensible space inspection. So it would be for 2024. They can provide that to you, and then that can be used as your disclosure. So I can give you that number, and I can show you the requesting link, and then we can go from there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
If you don't mind, what street, you don't have to give the address, but what? High Ridge. Currently that's in the, currently it is in the high fire severity zone.
And that's what I'm asking.
But it looks like, I think that's being High Ridge may be downgraded. And we can show you afterwards on the map here, we've got the streets here.
I've already been informed that inspection is required.
Subject with all of the city owns all this open space areas, and we are required to do certain clearance off every roadway and in the open space preserve areas. So it'll be very interesting what this this implication of this changing of the designation will have on our open space areas. But you can see most of our preserve areas are still in the very high fire severe, rightfully so. Yeah, and the city's been doing the GOAT program, I want to say almost 10, 12 years. I mean, we were one of the first cities to use GOATs for its fuel modification. And ever since we started doing it, all these other cities and private landowners have been following suit as well. So, yeah. Yeah.
What's going to change? Are we losing resources or?
No. It's less regulations on a property owner in terms of the defensible space. Yeah. I mean, I got calls from people saying, I can't believe I'm not on the map. And I'm like, well, you should be kind of grateful for that, because then you're not subject after next year. You're not going to be subject to all the inspections and the requirements to do all the clearing.
And that.
And like I've been mentioning about the building code, the city has a building code that is more stringent than the California building code to account for the fire risk here in Rancho Palos Verdes and the peninsula. So we do require, if you were, now that you're locating here, if you were to build a new house or do a substantial addition, you'd be required to do or install certain improvements or materials to harden the property. And we're not planning on downgrading that or changing that. You know, none of us are qualified to even comment on that. And you know, my comment at the very beginning was my own personal opinion, so I should make that very clear. I mean, you know, I know from my own experience how when you go through a transaction and they're telling you, look, you're in a risk area, you can't even get insurance now, fire insurance. You have to go through the FAIR plan, and so we don't know what the impacts are going to be with the insurance. And they will always say, and they being the state and so forth, that no, this map doesn't influence the your insurance. So we're going to call it a wrap. I think if you have any questions, we'll stick around and answer any questions. Again, the city's got all this information. If you want to access the interactive map, you're curious where your friend's designation is over in the Palisades area, you can go on the map and look at things. But thank you for coming out. Please spread the word. Mark your calendar. June 17th is when it'll go to the city council. If you're curious what the ultimate recommendation will be, you can go to the city's website and download the staff report. Thank you for coming out. Have a good night.